It's now my great pleasure to introduce Jonathon Porritt to you. If any of you are wondering how you're going to sustain through challenging times, deficits, new government, whatever that's going to pan out to look like once we're out of the honeymoon stage, then I think you could probably take a message from Jonathon's life. He's been excited and interested and passionate about sustainable development. He tells me since he was 17 or 18. He's been an English teacher, so he understands teaching and the classroom and school. He was heavily involved in the Green Party. He was the founding director of Forum for the Future, and for 10 years he was chair of the Sustainable Development Commission. He also supports many organisations and networks and individuals. For example, he's an ambassador for WWF, and he's been on many boards as well. He's a great supporter of education and the work that everyone is trying to do. And in fact, I don't know if people know this, but the way, you can tell me if I've got this wrong, but the reason we have a Sustainable Schools framework is because Charles Clarke in 2003 wrote the first Sustainable Development Action Plan for what is now DFE. And after a year, there had been very little progress on it. It was quite a challenging action plan, and I think the civil servants were finding it challenging. And so Jonathon had a chat with Charles Clarke, as I've been told it, and said to him, well, the Sustainable Development Commission can help you with this, because you're not making progress and people are getting a bit grumpy out there because they're expecting things to happen. And the bit that Jake Reynolds and DCSF got involved in heavily with the SDC then was the National Sustainable Schools Framework. So you can blame it all on Jonathon. So I'm not sure what Jonathon's going to talk about. He's going to talk for 20 minutes and then we're going to have a Q&A session with an open roving mic. So hold your questions till the end. Thank you, Jonathon.
Excellent. I'm always slightly nervous when people say you can blame it all on Jonathon. Actually, can blame quite a bit of that on Charles Clarke, it is true. Because he did indeed, just to remind you that Secretaries of State in departments can sometimes make things happen, and it is possible to overcome the inertia in all of these systems. And it is true that Charles Clarke was the first one to really start stirring the pot around this, because, you probably remind me about this, but practically his first day in office as Secretary of State, he had to appear in front of the Environmental Audit Committee to explain his department's failing to do anything about education for sustainable development. And it was one of those sessions where the EAC just decided to work him over. And Charles Clarke doesn't take kindly to that kind of stuff. And the apocryphal story has it that he came back to the department and said, that's it, I'm never going to have an experience like that in my life again. We're going to do it very differently from now on. They said, absolutely, Secretary of State, couldn't agree with him more. What we'll do is we'll go away and we'll write you a strategy. And forgive the language here, but I hope this is a true story. No more fucking strategies. I want an action plan. I want it by the end of next month. No, it's quite an interesting start to the day, really, because we do need a bit of table banging still around some of this stuff. And if Charles Clarke did manage to get some energy moving through those systems, sclerotic systems, sometimes in the department in those days, more power to him and politicians like him who can make things happen. And it is quite important to remember that. Yes, and you're right, we're bound to be a little bit nervous about an incoming government that still seems to be a little bit incoherent in what its basic core philosophy is about all sorts of different things. But I'll come back and explain why we shouldn't perhaps be too nervous about that. There is, of course, a circularity in all of this. I was a bit disturbed to hear from Penny that there weren't any cycles in Newham before this initiative got off the ground. My first teaching job was actually in Newham at a school called Langdon, and I'm really sorry to hear your news, Penny, because I was influential in bringing about the first cycling scheme for Langdon School, and by the end of my first year there we had 52 signed up cyclists from amongst the kids. They did think we were all completely and utterly bonkers, but it certainly helped galvanize a bit of action. So that's slightly upsetting if you think about the circularity here. And I was going to start this because earlier in the week I went to what is probably the most depressing meeting I've been to for a very long time, which was talking about 2012 and the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit in 1992. So the UN in its wisdom has decided that we need a 20th anniversary conference to, quotes, celebrate, quotes, the achievements that have been scored up since 1992. This meeting of people I went to, who were largely, it has to be said, economists, which may explain this. This meeting couldn't honestly summon up a celebratory impulse between them. It was practically impossible to think why you would convene the whole of the world 20 years on to sort of sit around various tables and in great big conference halls saying, well, what have we really achieved over the last 20 years? And find yourself with a depressingly short list of the things that have actually been happening. So eventually some good news began to surface about what's been going on, not least what's been happening in the field of education, and not just here in the UK and in OECD countries, but some of the amazing stuff going on about education for sustainable development in other countries, particularly in some of the developing and emerging countries, where, to a certain extent, this has taken off with a level of excitement and interest and passion that we sometimes ought to be mindful of and remind ourselves that our somewhat crabby approach to some of these things isn't necessarily reflected in other countries and their approach to ESD. So eventually, at the end of the meeting, yes, we'd all managed to summon up enough energy to say, well, it's probably worth doing something in 2012. But it did remind me that there is still a sense of living in a world in waiting, a world sort of still practicing the lines, which will then allow us to actually make sustainable living a reality. And we are doing so much practicing of these lines at the moment, whether it's about climate change or sustainable communities or biodiversity or waste management or thinking about different ways of generating wealth and social justice and the Millennium Development Goals. God, we have been practicing and practicing and practicing. And the language bit of it, it seems to me, is kind of practically all done now. The real problem is getting this traction in people's lives and on the ground. So for me, the real thought today is, how do we sustain what's already happened over the last few years? And we need to acknowledge that a lot has happened here in the UK over the last few years. The scene looks very different now from the day that Charles Clarke came into the department all those years ago. Very different. And the framework has made a huge difference. It has created an enabling set of opportunities for teachers to make SD much more of a reality in the lives of many more young people than would have been the case without it. So we need to be aware of that and realize that we're building on those foundations to take that forward.